Good afternoon. On behalf of the board and staff of IMFG, I am pleased to welcome you to our virtual event this afternoon on inclusionary zoning, best practices and lessons for Toronto. I'm Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I know this event is virtual, and I realize that everyone is in a different location. But I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to start by thanking the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maitrey, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, and the region of York. I'd also like to thank our team at IMFG for putting everything together today. We have Nevena Dragicevic and Piali Roy, and I would also like to thank the events and technical staff of the Munk School, Adam Bell and Daria Dombadzi. And lastly, a special thanks to Julie Ma. Julie's our IMFG postdoctoral fellow this year. The idea for this event was hers, and she helped to shape the discussion today. If you were tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. In 2018, the Ontario government gave municipalities the power to implement their own inclusionary zoning regulations. The City of Toronto seized on this opportunity with the final recommendations for its policy now set to go before Council in the next few months. So at IMFG, we thought it would be a good time to hear from some international and local experts who could highlight best practices and key considerations for designing and implementing inclusionary zoning in Toronto. You'll hear people refer to it as IZ or IZ throughout the discussion, because we do have some people here from the US who will be talking about IZ. We'll start with some brief opening remarks by our moderator, who is Susanna Bunce, followed by two presentations from IZ researchers Jenny Schutz and Fei Li. We'll then bring in some local experts, Deanna Chorney and Jeannie Shim, for our panel discussion and audience Q&A. There's more details on the bios of these people on our website, so we're not going to spend a lot of time going through them. You can ask questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll monitor these questions and ask them to the panelists at the end. So let me now turn over the panel discussion to our moderator, Susanna Bunce. Susanna is Associate Professor in the Department of Human Geography and City Studies program at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Over to you, Susanna.
Great. Thanks so much, Enid, for the kind introduction, and to IMFG for asking me to moderate this exciting panel today. I just have a few words before we get started to introduce inclusionary zoning to those of you who might not be familiar with what it is. So I'd like to start today's event by noting something that many Toronto residents feel and experience, that Toronto has become increasingly unaffordable for a growing proportion of its residents. So there's an increasing spatial disparity in terms of where people live, and with the central city area becoming prohibitively expensive and more residents living in the peripheries of the city in order to secure less expensive housing. And they face challenges with finding affordable housing. And certainly this is increasingly difficult with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed further cleavages in the housing market and an increasing divide between residents who can afford rising house prices and other residents who are struggling to maintain their housing. Affordable housing is increasingly difficult to define and to attain as well. So in terms of more globally with cities across the world. simply defined inclusionary zoning as a policy and regulatory tool that requires private developers to set aside a percentage of their new housing units as affordable. Along with other policy and regulatory mechanisms, inclusionary zoning has been discussed in Toronto over the past years as a way to help improve housing affordability. For many proponents of IZ, its potential lies in its ability to leverage high growth housing markets and its reliance on the private sector to build affordable housing, especially in light of reduced government involvement in affordable housing provision. But IZ is also quite complicated. The structure of inclusionary policies can vary greatly from one city to the next, and there are questions about definitions of affordability and inclusion. And the reliance also on the development industry to create affordable housing raises some interesting questions as well. The following presentations and the panel discussion today will address some of these important issues and concerns, including some of the best practices of IZ, we can call them WISE practices, and ideas from other cities as well. So I would now like to introduce our two speakers who will also join us for the panel discussion after the presentation, Jenny Schutz and Fei Li. Jenny Schutz is a senior fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. She's an expert in urban economics and housing policy, focusing particularly on housing affordability. And Fei Li is an assistant professor at the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State University. She is currently exploring mandatory affordable housing requirements for private housing developments and their effects on housing production and income segregation. So Jenny, you'll be speaking first, so it's my pleasure to hand it over to you. And then Fei will follow you after you finish presenting.
Great. Thank you, Susanna, and thank you to the organizers of this event for giving me a chance to come and talk to you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everybody can see the slides. Great. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of how inclusionary zoning, or IZ, works in the US, and pull out some of the lessons that we have learned. The earliest IZ programs in the US have been around since about the 1970s, so we have a very long time frame to evaluate, and it's been implemented in a lot of very different kinds of geographies and housing markets, which is useful. So Susanna gave a terrific, very succinct overview of what inclusionary zoning is. I'm going to just specify that so sometimes when people talk about IZ, they really mean only the mandatory programs where the local government requires developers to set aside some below market rate units. Sometimes this is used in different terminology than an sort of an incentive zoning or a voluntary program, but I'm going to include both of these in my discussion today because that is one of the big choices that local governments have to make in sort of what we call maybe voluntary inclusionary zoning or incentive housing. Developers can choose to participate in the program and to set aside below market rate units in exchange for some sort of a concession or a bonus, which generally takes the form of something like a density bonus that you can build extra stories or more units per acre, but could take other forms like streamlined permitting. So both the mandatory and the voluntary version of this are going to be covered in the data that I show you today. As Susanna said, there are lots and lots of ways that IZ programs can be designed, many, many dimensions, and the choice of design really matters quite a lot for fitting the program to the local housing market context, serving particular kinds of goals that the local government has articulated, and very much from the local government's perspective, how difficult and complicated it is to oversee and monitor the program. So just to go through sort of the basics of how this is supposed to work, IZ is one of the more popular programs in the US to create below market rate housing without requiring a direct public subsidy. And that's a really important component because local governments generally don't have the resources to build fully subsidized housing for low-income households or provide household-based subsidies. At the local level, resources are just not available to do that. And so this is one of the things that local governments can do without requiring a subsidy from the province or from the federal government. As Susanna pointed out, it's really important to understand that IZ works very much with the private real estate market. And one of the consequences of that is that it's pro-cyclical, meaning that at a time where there's a lot of demand to build market rate housing and developers are building a lot, a high volume, that you will get more affordable units as part of that component. The flip side is when the private market softens and there's not a lot of construction, that's going to be a time period when no additional affordable units are coming on board because of IZ. And so that's an important consideration, right? At the moment, there are potentially some opportunities to acquire land or properties because the market is softening in some places. And that's a different approach to doing something like IZ. So just to be aware of sort of the timing of this. One of the really big questions, sort of conceptual questions about IZ is who pays for the subsidy, because there isn't an explicit subsidy attached to it. And depending on the housing market conditions, it could be the developer in lower profits. It could be the people who buy or rent the market rate units in the same development. It could be landowners, and sort of who bears the incidence in tax terms varies quite a lot depending on the market. So just to give a couple of examples, in very hot housing markets where people are willing to pay a lot of money for the market rate units, developers are able essentially to do an internal cross subsidy. So they will increase the rents or the prices for market rate units and use funding to feed back into essentially an operating subsidy for the below market rate units, right? So in that case, the subsidy is essentially people in the market rate units spending more than they would have without the program to subsidize their less affluent neighbors. This also depends very much on the regional context. Developers generally have an option of which jurisdiction to work in. So they can go across city or town boundaries or counties. If there is a jurisdiction that has inclusionary zoning right next to a jurisdiction that doesn't, developers may choose to go to a place where they don't have to participate, right? Or someplace that has a voluntary program rather than mandatory. So that's worth thinking about in the regional context. This is less of a concern for sort of the biggest cities that have very strong markets. So New York City, for instance, developers will choose to work there rather than the suburbs because it's really quite a separate market. But for smaller kind of suburban markets, this is an issue that they may just lose out on development altogether. And just to think about the design of this, if the developer gets a substantial density bonus or streamlined permitting or something that reduces their cost, then they don't have to make quite such a big difference in the rent or the price of market rate units, right? So there are ways to design the program that soften the impact on market outcomes. I want to show you just an overview of how much inclusionary zoning, how much affordable housing has been produced through these programs. This is a couple of the regions where IZ is particularly prevalent in the US. California, both Northern and Southern California have had IZ for several decades now. This is very widespread in the Boston suburbs, even among some quite small places, in the Washington, DC suburbs and the district itself in New York City. So these are all really high cost regions where there's strong demand for housing. There's a lot of need for below market rate housing. And lots of local governments have chosen to adopt some form of IZ. You can see there's enormous variation in how much this is produced on average per year. So some of these programs have been around longer, so this is all annual numbers. The DC suburbs have produced a lot. Part of this is because those are mostly counties and they're very large. So Montgomery and Fairfax County have over 1 million people. They're large city sized. They have also had these programs for a long time in sort of a period of very rapid housing growth, and we're able to capture a lot of this. The Boston suburbs, on average, have produced fewer than 2 affordable units per year, and actually a large share of them have produced no affordable housing, partly because these are places that just don't build much market rate housing at all. But these are also, in some cases, local governments that adopted IZ and didn't really know how to manage the program, and so essentially haven't enforced it on development. It's very hard to do good empirical research on the effects of IZ on local housing markets, in part because these programs are just really complicated. And so nailing down what the characteristics of the programs are, how they work with or against the local market characteristics, and even just collecting data on the outcomes and the outputs is quite difficult. Faye is going to spend some time talking about the programs in London and give you some evidence on that. I will say the overview is, in general, IZ has had some deterrence to market rate housing development, particularly in places where the program is very inflexible. And so developers don't have an option to buy their way out or to negotiate on this. But the effects really vary a lot, depending both on the time period and on the local market characteristics. And a lot of places will tell you that essentially IZ is part of a negotiating package. Local governments negotiate over a lot of things: affordable housing contributions, payments to infrastructure funds, even things like schools and parks all get negotiated. And so IZ is only one of the things that's bringing them to the table. A couple of questions that are helpful for local governments that are thinking about designing and implementing IZ. It's useful to be very clear about what the affordable housing goals are. So for instance, is it more important to maximize the total number of units, or are you particularly interested in getting some affordability into high income areas where maybe it would be difficult to do traditional kinds of subsidized housing? Are there particular either geographic areas, income areas, age, or demographics? So many of the components of IZ really will be driven by what the goals are and who you're trying to serve. And just as an example of that, some IZ programs allow developers to do offsite development. So they can either contribute land or they can put money in to build in a different location. If they're building in a very expensive location where land costs are very high, it may be that you can actually get more total affordable units by doing offsite development in a cheaper location, but that then misses the economic integration. And so if that's an important component, then not allowing there to be offsite might be the option that you choose, right? So there are direct trade-offs between a number of these different goals. And just to be aware, most IZ programs in the US do not reach very low income households because the amount of subsidy it takes to reach them is just too big. So this is something that can reach moderate income households, potentially low income households, depending on the overall cost levels. But this could also be paired with, for instance, vouchers, which would make the units affordable at a deeper level. It's really important to think about what the local housing market conditions are. In areas that don't have strong housing markets, IZ just isn't going to produce that much housing, and so it's probably not the best strategy. Thinking about the regional implications, to what extent are local governments within the region designing similar kinds of programs? If not, there winds up being a fair amount of gaming by developers moving across jurisdictions that you want to be aware of. And then a point that doesn't get brought up a lot, but is really important for the local government, is to think about, what kind of capacity do you have to implement this and to oversee the programs? So because IZ is essentially a negotiation between the city and the developer, you have to have staff whose full-time job it is to engage in those negotiations, who can look at the pro formas developers come up with and say, yes, this works, or no, this doesn't, who understand the financing and are able to figure out how to make this work, making sure that they're complying with this. So if there are tiers at different levels of affordability, IZ is not a sort of a low maintenance kind of policy for local governments. And we see, particularly in the smaller communities that adopt these programs, they essentially wind up not using it because it's just too labor intensive on the staff and they don't have the time or the expertise to do this. If programs are going to be adopted, it's also very important to make sure that there's a mechanism for tracking units coming online. You know how much has been produced. If there's an affordability time period, that also the restrictions are in place for the full length of time. So don't sort of put this in place thinking it's going to run itself. It needs actual human beings to run it as well. So I will pause there, and I look forward to Faye's presentation.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I'm going to pass it over to Faye and to follow you up, and you've given some really interesting food for thought for the discussion period as well. So, Faye, can I ask you to share your screen? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Susanna, and great to be part of this conversation. So here I call the policy, the similar policy, mandatory inclusionary housing in London, but pretty much I will use inclusionary housing interchangeably with inclusionary zoning or IZ. Jenny already gave a great overview of IZ. What I would just want to add a few words about IZ being increasingly used as a land value recapture strategy and its increasing popularity pretty much across the world in the past few decades kind of accompany the trend of privatization in affordable housing construction. There has been this trend of either local or national governments kind of withdrawing and providing less funding for direct provision of affordable housing. And that's why IZ is becoming more promising as a way of letting the market cross-subsidize affordable housing. So ideally, you extract the value, the increase in land value from either public work or planning, upzoning. So ideally, the cost should not be passed on to consumers or home buyers. But that, as you can see, is being one of the two common criticisms for IZ is that it actually pushes up housing costs. The two primary objectives or benefits of IZ, of course, one is to produce more affordable housing, and the other one is to embed affordable housing in market rate development. So hopefully that will create more mixed income developments and communities and promote social inclusion and integration. And the other common criticism for IZ is that it tends to not produce a lot of affordable housing, that many programs, as Jenny also showed, in some jurisdictions tend to be pretty narrowly defined and just apply to a small number of developments and produce a handful of affordable units. So I have also a summary here, which is not as comprehensive as Jenny's. A recent report here shows, so they actually surveyed, I think, over 1,000 local IZ programs in the US, but not all of them have very detailed data on the affordable housing output. So among 221, on average, each of these programs produced 27 units per year. And that, of course, is kind of obscuring this wide range of, from the most productive programs that produce tens of thousands of units to very small programs that produce maybe a few dozens of units. There are also reports on these different program features. As Jenny mentioned, these local programs could vary in terms of whether they are mandatory or voluntary. The percentage of affordable housing or the set-asides required, the duration of affordability, the level of affordability, so many differences. And reports found that mandatory programs tend to be more productive or effective in terms of providing affordable housing and maintaining affordability than voluntary ones. And the more successful programs tend to be more flexible and allow more incentives or cost offsets, such as density bonuses. So on the other objective of IZ, the distribution or dispersal of affordable units, there have been fewer empirical studies reporting some mixed evidence. There is evidence showing that the affordable units provided under IZ did enter some poor neighborhoods, but they might still be disproportionately in minority and low-income neighborhoods. And on the housing market effects, again, including Jenny's own study, Jenny already talked about how difficult it can be to evaluate how exactly IZ affected housing supply or housing prices. A recent study that's kind of interesting is using this court decision in California, Palmer, that limited local government's ability to apply IZ to rental housing because that could be considered as rent control. So following that court decision, it can be seen as this statewide shock that just removed or weakened IZ on rental housing from all the jurisdictions in California. So if IZ had limited rental housing supply or increased rental housing costs, then you should expect to see a reversal after Palmer. But that's not what Hollenshed observed in this study. She actually saw that jurisdictions with previous rental IZ programs have seen faster growing rents after Palmer. So that means after removal of this IZ regulation, they actually see higher rental costs. So that seems to suggest the existence of the IZ didn't increase rental costs or actually made rental housing more affordable. So in England, sometimes referred to as the planning gain approach. It is like in some states in the United States, and now like in Ontario, it's enabled, the local application of AZ was enabled by a series of national policies, starting by the nationalization of development rights in 1950s and 60s. So therefore, any approval of development plans could be considered as a planning gain, and therefore developers are expected to pay a planning obligation, which typically includes affordable housing. And actually, affordable housing can be the biggest part of it in London. So there is this national and then followed by a regional in the Greater London area. This Greater London Authority is the regional planning authority in Greater London. And in the London plan that made a framework of IZ for the local planning authorities, there are 33 local planning authorities under Greater London Authority. So the London plan set a baseline for how affordable housing requirements should be laid out in these Section 106 agreements. And local authorities have some flexibility to like add on to that to apply more strict standards or higher set-asides. So here are the main players. The local planning authorities reach these Section 106 agreements with the private developers, which define how much affordable housing should be provided. And in some situations, if the developers could prove that there is a financial hardship, they could use third-party viability assessment to prove that they need a variation or exemption. They could provide affordable housing offsite. They could provide land elsewhere, or they could pay an in-lieu payment. But of course, the local authorities would prefer in-kind contribution because payments are rarely enough for equivalent amount of affordable housing construction. And then the resultant affordable units would be transferred to housing associations, which the nonprofit owners of affordable housing and different types of affordable housings include social rented housing, which are genuinely affordable, very low rent, could be like 30% of market rent. And intermediate housing, including some rental housing for moderate income families and also some shared ownership housing. And the third category that we introduced in the past decade was affordable rent, which allows up to 80% of market rent. So both rental housing and shared ownership housing will be transferred to housing associations for management and distribution to low-income households. So the chart here shows how the usage of Section 106 agreements in providing affordable housing had picked up really since the 2000s. And by late 2000, they have become the primary means of providing new affordable housing. Over 60% of new completions delivered by Section 106 agreements. And this shows the minimum set-asides in some of the London local authorities. And the blank authorities were the ones that didn't define a specific percentage, but say we will seek the maximum share possible. Among the ones that had some minimum set-asides typically have the percentage between 30 to 50%, which is fairly high compared to most local programs in the US. So I have done two empirical studies, one on the social inclusion outcome of IZ in London and one on the market response to expansion of IZ. For time's sake, I would not go very far into the details, but I'll just summarize the findings here, but I'm happy to talk more if there are any questions. So regarding the distribution of affordable housing delivered under IZ, I found that they're actually more spatially concentrated than affordable housing created by conventional means by housing associations or local authorities. And both types of affordable housing tend to be, again, disproportionately located in poor minority neighborhoods with higher levels of concentration of existing affordable units. This association also holds when I look at the development level of on-site inclusion of affordable housing and also the percentage included. So the second study looks at an extension of IZ to smaller sites. So this is a change in the threshold size from 15 units to 10 units. And what happened here is we assumed that developers could react in a certain number of ways, which could lead to a decrease in the target size developments, which is what we observed here. So whatever the threshold size is, there tends to be a cliff in the number of developments. So this is the old threshold at 15 units and the new threshold at 10 units. But what's interesting here is this maneuvering didn't lead to any net loss of new housing. So it's simply a shift of development from the market segment covered by IZ to the segment that's not covered by IZ. So here are some main lessons that we can draw from the London case. One is that IZ doesn't necessarily put affordable housing where they need it most, in the most unaffordable neighborhoods. And then we do see evidence showing that the introduction or expansion of IZ could divert some development to unregulated alternative markets, but not necessarily leading to net loss of new housing development. And third, as Jenny just mentioned, we see the importance of having consistent data on the evaluation of the effectiveness of IZ. Right, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Faye and Jenny, for your interesting presentations. We don't have a lot of time. We only have half an hour left to have a panel presentation or panel discussion, and then time for question and answer. So if you could please just add your questions as we go along with the discussion or the panel discussion in the question and answer box, that'd be great. And then our panelists will be able to answer them in the period after the panel discussion. So I'd love to invite Jeannie Shim and Deanna Shorney to join us for the panel discussion part of today's session. So welcome, Jeannie and Deanna. So I'd like to introduce you both before we move into the questions. Jeannie Shim is the founding president of the Housing Lab Toronto, which is an independent real estate development consulting firm. And she also serves on the board of directors at Waterfront Toronto. Deanna Chorney is a project manager with the City of Toronto City Planning Division since 2016. Deanna has been leading the work on advancing inclusionary zoning at the City of Toronto. So in the time that we do have left, I have a series of individual questions and then one open question to the whole panel that I hope that you can all jump in and answer. So for the sake of time, I'd like to start first with a question to Deanna. So could you please provide a brief update of where the City of Toronto's inclusionary zoning policy stands right now, how it's going at the City of Toronto in terms of inclusionary zoning policy development?
Yes, thanks, Susanna. So after many, many years of asking the province for the authority to use inclusionary zoning, the city is finally in the process of developing our first IZ policy framework. And over the past few years, we've been working hard to develop a policy framework that takes into consideration the city's unique housing needs and market realities. And as part of this work, we've undertaken 3 key pieces of work to help inform our approach. The first is financial analysis to assess where IZ can work in the city. The second is an in-depth look at housing need in the city and various market indicators. And finally, we've undertaken extensive consultation with the public, housing advocates, and the development industry to make sure our assumptions are sound and we have identified the right priorities. So I think, as Enid had mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we're aiming to report to City Council with our final recommended policies and zoning bylaw in Q2. And as part of this work, we're looking at updating our financial analysis to make sure we're taking into consideration all of COVID impacts and so forth. It's important to note, though, that once IZ is adopted by City Council, if it is, it could be appealed by the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. As well, IZ is only able to be implemented in what are called protected major transit station areas. And the city is prioritizing this work in order to have a comprehensive planning framework in place. I would say I think it's a very exciting time for IZ. We know there's many other municipalities across the region who are also advancing their own policies. And I think we're really seeing affordable housing prioritized throughout the planning process across the province.
Great, thanks, Deanna. My second question is to Jeannie. What are the major concerns from private developers about inclusionary zoning? So how can planners and policymakers encourage collaboration with private developers in the implementation of IZ?
From the development community's perspective, I think I know everyone is in agreement that affordable housing is a problem, and that the development community has a role to play. The objectives are good, but it all comes down to the details, right? About the execution, and the fear that kind of a blunt instrument, where it's kind of applied across every site, regardless of site-specific conditions, often is the biggest challenge, right? Because and it sounds from the documentation and the research that Jenny and Faye have done, is that kind of flexibility and being responsive to site-specific conditions seems to increase success in delivering affordable housing, as well as offering some sort of financial compensation. Because the reality is the IZ policies are asking the private sector to deliver affordable housing, and there is a cost involved there. You have to remember in pro formas, right? You've got kind of 4 big buckets. You have your land cost, you have your construction costs, which includes hard and soft, you have your revenue, and you have your profit. So when you kind of impose kind of IZ policies, you're limiting your revenue potential, yet your construction costs remain high. If you've bought the land, it's at a certain price based on a certain density. If you're negotiating the land price, you're doing a residual land value analysis. So there's so many pieces that go into making a development work that it's certainly, there is a cost to developing affordable housing. And one of the biggest tools could be the financial compensation. And there seems to be lots of examples from other jurisdictions of whether it's density bonusing, cash in lieu, cost offsets, there seems to be lots of examples of ways to work together with the private sector in order to, at the end of the day, the goal is to deliver affordable housing as much as we can. Another concern, as I mentioned, is to be flexible and responsive to site conditions, whether it's the size of the project, the specific locations. And again, I think Jenny had mentioned that we're really assuming that IZ works really well when we're in a rising or a high market, right? Where you can transfer the cost to the buyers or the other tenants. What happens when the market softens? So there's a bunch of other, that flexibility we believe needs to be really built into the IZ policies. Another idea or concern here is just making sure we got that transparency and the predictability, which I guess, Deanna, when we get the result of the actual details, we'll see a lot more of that. And just lastly, I'll say execution. What will the definition of affordability be? Because even within that, there's huge variations, whether you're 80% of market rents versus 30%, like that is a direct impact on the pro formas. And other issues like grandfathering, like when this policy comes in place, what if you already have an application in the system or you bought land? So again, those are little details, but significant details if our overall goal is really to be able to deliver as much affordable and impactful affordable housing as possible.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeannie. So I have a question back to Deanna. Could you highlight some of the major findings from the city's impact studies on IZ and how these have helped to shape considerations and parameters regarding set aside requirements?
So, you know, as I mentioned, our work has been informed by market and housing need analysis and extensive consultation. And one of the big pieces of feedback we received as part of our consultations is that the affordable housing units should be provided on a long-term basis. So we've updated our policies to reflect this priority and proposed that units would be maintained as affordable for 99 years. So we always knew that a final IZ approach would require balancing a number of different objectives. So we've asked our consultants to test a 99-year affordability period to see what type of set aside could be achieved based on financial modeling. So, you know, the big thing, we know that IZ has a different impact in different geographies in the city, and that purpose-built rental projects are already disadvantaged in the development process and can't provide the same level of affordable housing. It's also important to note that our analysis clearly showed that IZ works best in areas where land values are strong, and that the impact of IZ can be borne through a reduction in that land value. So based on this, the city has proposed a 10% IZ requirement for condominium projects in what we're calling strong market areas. And we've cut that requirement in half for areas of the city that currently have more moderate market conditions and for purpose-built rental projects. We're also looking at whether we could achieve a higher set-aside rate in very strong market areas of the city. And that work is still underway. So we know that the financial impact analysis we've undertaken is critical to help frame the policy, and has really been important to help determine that set-aside rate and what would be viable.
I can just jump in. So one other consideration that we haven't talked about is the sort of the difference in structure types. So for instance, Montgomery County, Maryland, which is one of the oldest programs, initially adopted IZ at a time that they were largely doing kind of greenfields development of either single family detached or row houses. And so they were able to give pretty substantial density bonuses essentially by just shrinking the lot size of the house. So for a given parcel of land, you could fit more on it, but the construction type didn't change that much. So this is, you know, relatively low rise. It's different when you get into vertical construction because construction costs don't go up sort of linearly with each floor. They're kind of jumps, right? So under 6 stories, you know, is a different construction cost than sort of the high rise, and you have to add an extra elevator and so forth. So this is really important when thinking about, for instance, a density bonus that lets you go from 4 stories to 5 stories or 4 to 6 stories without changing the construction cost per square foot may be pretty valuable. But if you're at 6 stories already and the density bonus means you have to go to a different structure type, the developer may not be able to take advantage of that. So this is the kind of really fine-grained why, you know, as Jeannie said, like site-specific details actually do matter, right? A site where you can reasonably take advantage of a bonus or you can bring down the construction costs somehow is very different than someplace where it's kind of locked in.
Great. Thanks, Deanna and Jenny. Jenny, this is, and Faye, this is a question to both of you, and either can answer or you can both answer the question. Do you have anything you would like to add in terms of adding on to your presentations from before, in terms of how other cities, such as London, and in terms of your own research, Faye, are achieving the maximum number of affordable units through their IZ or IZ policies? I don't know if Faye, do you want to go first on that? Or, okay.
Sorry, I think I agree with what Jenny said at the end of her presentation about the trade-offs that sometimes the local governments need to face between the different objectives of IZ. It's adopting the pronunciation that's suggested by one of the participants. So there does seem to be a trade-off, at least in my observation, between this like integration versus quantity of affordable housing. Because sometimes developers promise to provide more affordable housing offset. So that certainly led to, I think, some of that spatial concentration of the affordable units. So it really depends on the agenda of local governments, but we also need to consider like what's the level that's most meaningful for integration. Because by definition or by design, IZ kind of guarantees some kind of project level integration, but that doesn't always guarantee, social interaction between the low income households and the market rate housing residents. So oftentimes we see that the affordable units in a project kind of use a different exit or a different elevator, and they don't necessarily have access to the amenities like swimming pool, lounge. So it makes you question, like, do we care more about putting these people in a high value neighborhood or in this market rate housing project? So that's something to consider.
Can I add to that, Susanna, that on what Faye said, that, yeah, I mean, regarding putting affordable housing, for example, in high income neighborhoods, I understand, the social goal, but you also have to remember that even if they can afford to live in their apartment, when they go downstairs, they probably can't even afford to shop in any of the stores nearby. And they probably then have to commute to go to places where they can afford to shop and or access service, other kind of life, kind of support services that they may need. So that's another consideration, I think, that we need to look into.
Yeah, and I'll just add that DC is having has been very successful in generating affordable units. It's a relatively new program. They have been pretty aggressive about asking for affordable units in large projects, and much of the new housing built in DC in the last 10 years has been really large projects where there was sort of like a parcel of land owned by the federal government that they could do a master planned redevelopment. So, 500 to 1,000 units and a couple of buildings. And those are the kinds of projects that usually can absorb some amount of affordability. There's kind of a handful of neighborhoods that have done really large quantities of construction. And so there's a bunch of new market rate and affordable in those units. The most affluent and most expensive parts of DC build no new housing at all. They're by and large single family detached neighborhoods. They are locked into their R1 zoning. Even along the transit corridors, and some of them are around metro stations, the neighbors there will not allow market rate housing to be built or any kind of housing. And so to the idea of, do we want to create affordable options in high income communities? If those high income communities won't build, they won't build affordable units. And so to some extent, the social integration has failed in the places you would want to push it, including around some really sort of accessible neighborhoods with great transit access and lots of good commercial access and access to jobs that just absolutely will not build anything.
Great. Thanks to you all. I realize we're getting close to the end here. So I did have a question to all of the panelists, but I think what I'll do is hold on to that and just hand the questions over to the audience. We do have a number of questions that have come in, and so I'm hoping that all of you can jump in and answer. Some of the questions are directed to particular panelists, but most of them are open. So the first question is from Sean Bull. What are the typical oversight and administrative commitments for municipalities that introduce IZ policies? I don't know if one or a few of you can jump in on that. Are there any oversight and administrative mechanisms?
I mean, I don't know that there's a typical version of that. It really varies a lot. Generally there is a department within the city that is assigned sort of primary responsibility for it. It could be the planning department, or it could be if there's a sort of a housing finance agency. So that varies from place to place. And essentially it's triggered when the application for a permit comes in. In big expensive markets, there's almost always kind of a long negotiation process where the developer is talking to the local government, usually has to have some community engagement. And so, if they put in a proposal that would trigger the IZ requirement, it's the start of an ongoing conversation. And so in large part, it's sort of who owns that from the city's perspective, who is authorized to do the negotiation. In some cases, this can be done essentially with ministerial authority decisions by the staff at the agency. In some cases, projects may have to be approved even by the city council. So in places like Chicago, for instance, the city council members have a lot of authority, particularly to veto projects in their own council districts. So this may be a political project, or this may be something that can be done internally through sort of the bureaucratic staff.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Deanna, Jeannie, Faye, I don't know if you want to jump in on that particular question.
I would just
Deanna?
jump in to say that certainly for the city, since we proposed a 99-year affordability period, we're also looking at sort of that monitoring process over that period, and are working with other divisions of the city to make sure that really there's sort of the same approach, whether these are inclusionary zoning units or new affordable housing units or social housing units, that they're monitored and maintained in the same manner.
Great, thanks, Deanna. Another question from Tim Donagani. Jenny mentioned that flexible mandatory programs tend to be more effective than inflexible and optional ones. So Jenny, can you talk a bit more about what characterizes a flexible program?
Yeah, generally it's something that has sort of a menu of cost offsets, and the developer can choose what works. So one distinction would be what we've mentioned before, whether the affordable units have to be built on site, integrated into the main project, or can be done off site. Again, sometimes it makes more sense to do it elsewhere, either for cost reasons or kind of the site structure. If there's a density bonus, how much of that is there, and is that something that's negotiable? In places where existing zoning is set well below where developers would like to build, a density bonus can add quite a lot of value. In places with a very long and complicated process and very discretionary process, making IZ programs essentially close to as of right, so streamlining the permitting process, shortening the time to development, saves on the soft costs. So understanding sort of what the cost drivers are in a particular city and a location, and then being flexible and working with the developer to meet that, is generally the way to get sort of, the object from the city's point of view is to get the project built so that the units come online, and to figure out how to make that work financially.
Great, thanks, Jenny. We have had a lot of questions about sunset clauses, so I'm hoping that all of you can speak to this question. What is the prevalence of projects with a sunset rule? So do we know what happens to tenants when IZ expires, and is there a risk of eviction when IZ does expire? I don't know.
Yeah, so most of the...
Okay.
A lot of the programs in the US are within sort of 20 years or so. This has been particularly popular in the last 20 years. So many of them haven't yet hit that point. But I will say that a lot of them are rentals, and most tenants don't stay in the same unit or the same property for that length of time. So it's less a question of there's going to be a hard stop to the end of affordability when somebody has a lease and that they get pushed out as the unit becomes less affordable, and more as the unit turns over, it may transition from a below market rate unit to a market rate unit in the property, and they sort of phase out. But really, we haven't run into that, and the length of time also varies a lot. So there are some places that have, as Toronto is apparently considering, a 99-year affordability restriction. Most of the apartments built in the US, the building isn't going to be functional in 99 years, so it kind of doesn't matter, right? The property will be redeveloped entirely before we hit that point.
Thanks, Jenny. Deanna, Jeannie, Faye, I don't know if you want to remark on that or answer that question. Deanna?
I just, further to what Jenny was saying, we haven't also, in terms of where we've secured affordable housing, breached that sunset clause. But I think, certainly for the Ontario context, the fact is that, a few years ago, the provincial government brought in sort of rent protections for units built after a certain date and then changed those. I think a lot of that will dictate what sort of protections are in place for tenants later on. Certainly the city's goal is that any sitting tenants at the end of an affordability period would continue to be protected in terms of only getting the guideline increase under the Residential Tenancies Act.
Yeah, I think the sunset issue is important because, 25, 30, 40 years, what's going to happen afterwards? Yeah. Are there evictions? Who knows? But I think the important thing is that we know that, the affordable housing needs aren't going to go away. I don't want to be a pessimist, but they will always be there. So I think it's important. And whether it's in perpetuity, whether it's 99 years, at least once we know what it is, we can then hopefully negotiate, financial incentives, other incentives to try to make that model work. But the longer is certainly better if our goal really is in a recognition that affordable housing, it should always be part of a well-functioning city.
Thanks, Jeannie. Kate, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question.
Yeah, in London's case, their affordable housing, the affordability doesn't expire. And I think in general, preserving affordable housing is, I think, the important goal of IZ, because some of these developments happen in, gentrifying neighborhoods, and they're already removing existing affordable housing to build these new developments. So we want to keep affordability, and having affordability for like 20 years kind of defeats that purpose.
Thanks, all of you. The next question is from Rob Burton. With a high demand market and a council highly concerned with getting 30% affordable housing, I think they're referring to the City of Toronto Council, is IZ able to help us with our vision of social mixing and housing affordability? Deanna, that seems like a question specifically for you, but I think everybody can jump in on that question too, perhaps with examples from other places.
Yeah, so the city, we brought our draft policies to City Council, our Planning and Housing Committee in the fall, and at that time they asked us to look at a higher set-aside rate, so up to 30% as per the question. And I think, there's a few different pieces. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Susanna, could you just repeat that question again? Sorry.
So with the high demand market and the City of Toronto Council concerned for getting 30% affordable housing, is IZ able to help us with our vision of social mixing and housing affordability? So
thank you.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say is that, we've always acknowledged and understood that IZ isn't the one tool that's going to solve our affordable housing crisis. We know that there's many different initiatives that the city needs to take. I think IZ really does have the opportunity to create mixed income communities because it relies on where there's higher land values and a lot of development activity, where we're not seeing the same level of affordable housing being produced through the public sector. So certainly in terms of my own aspirations, I think it is a good tool to achieve that end.
Great, thanks, Gianna. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on.
I just want to jump in quickly. I would agree that, IZ is just one tool, right? We can't just look at that and the private sector as the be all end all solution. It should be, can play a part, but there's definitely should be other tools that should be explored. For example, public transit, that can certainly unlock, accessibility to other locations, maybe where land prices are lower. And so again, I think there's a whole other bunch of other things that we can look at. Is there an opportunity for some sort of a cash in lieu? We've got a 1% for public art. Are there other tools that can be used to be able to fund kind of construction, let's say by not-for-profits of affordable housing? Because remember, with IZ, you're driving up sales prices, and when you drive up sales prices, you're driving up land value. So it's almost you're kind of like reinforcing, prices to continue going up. So the higher your requirement, again, the goals are important and we agree on them, but look at maybe the unintended consequences that we're kind of continuing to feed this perpetual machine of prices going up, perhaps a bit artificially to compensate for that. So that's where other tools like density bonusing, there again, it would be great to have kind of like a menu, as Jenny said, of different options that can be looked at for very site specifically.
Great, thanks to you both. I think we have time for one last question before we wrap up at 5 today. So the question is from Gianna Dutton. Are there any examples for IZ used as a mechanism to incentivize adaptive reuse conversion from office to residential use. It's a question about adaptive reuse.
I'm not familiar with it. So most of the cases that I've studied, it's really used to attach to new construction. In theory, it could be, so conversion from a non-residential to residential, I think it would depend on the pricing, whether or not that works. At the moment, there's a lot of conversation about, can we take empty offices that people aren't going to want to work in anymore and convert them to housing? The cost of doing that is often very expensive if the floor plate is not really appropriate. So it may actually be more expensive to do the conversion than to do new construction. So I think you'd want to be careful about that. Adaptive reuse is something that has an enormous amount of variability in the costs. And so it may be hard to kind of to do the financial modeling that Deanna and her colleagues have been doing and kind of estimate the feasibility of that.
Sorry.
Sorry. I was just going to say it's an interesting question. And I think that in terms of a planning obligation in England, that would apply to conversions as long as there are some new residential units created. But I would hesitate to say that would be an incentive. It could be more seen as a barrier in some cases.
I just wanted to add in lastly, Susanna, quickly that, yeah, it's intuitively, it seems to all of us that, oh, if you're converting a building, it should cost less. But often, and I've been involved in market projects where you're converting, often the cost is higher, even though that seems totally counterintuitive. But as Jenny said, there it's not automatic that it'll be less expensive to convert a building.
Thank you. Deanna, do you have comments on that from the City of Toronto's perspective?
Nothing more from me.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we're right at the end. Thank you all for really interesting presentations, and or to Faye and Jenny for your interesting presentations, and to all of you for a really interesting panel discussion answers. So I'm going to hand it over to Enid Slack to say a few concluding remarks. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Susanna. And thank you to Faye and Jenny, Deanna and Jeannie. That was a great discussion. I know we could have gone on much longer. I'll just say that the second last question, which talked about council and affordable housing, was really about the town of Oakville. Welcome, Mayor Burton, who asked the question. It wasn't actually about Toronto, but I think the answer is perhaps can go to other municipalities as well. It really was a great session. I think what I've learned is that the devil's in the details. IZ, as we're now calling it, even our American friends, is fairly straightforward when you describe it. It's when you actually implement it that it is more complicated. So again, thank you very much. A number of people have asked if today's event is being recorded, and it is, and it will be available on our website in a few days. I don't love virtual meetings. I'm sure most of you don't, but there are some advantages. One is that we were able to bring in people from around the world, not only as panelists and speakers, but also our audience. And I can tell you from the number of people who have been participating, there's no way we had a room big enough to hold everyone. So it's great to have everybody. And as I say, for those of you who want to listen to it again, please share, look at it when it comes online, and we will pass the questions on. We didn't get to answer a lot of them. We will pass them on to the speakers, though, so they have your questions after the event. So thank you very much, and have a great evening.